Hi everyone, welcome to our talk Exploring the Flora of Rathlin Island. This is a talk that we gave at the BSBI Autumn Meeting last week, and we thought we'd make a recorded version of it available online. We've lived on Rathlin for about 7.5 years now, and we spent a lot of that time exploring and recording the island's biodiversity, including the diverse plant life. In this talk, we'll take a quick look at some of the characteristic habitats and special species that we have on the island. We'll talk a bit about some of our own botanical recording projects and some of the discoveries we've made since we've been on the island.
First of all, in case anyone's not familiar with Rathlin, here's where the island is on the map. It's 4 kilometres off the north coast of Antrim by the shortest distance, going from Fairhead on the mainland to the southern tip of the island. By ferry, it's slightly further, travelling from Ballycastle into Church Bay, and that takes 20 to 40 minutes, depending on whether you get the passenger-only ferry or the vehicle ferry. Church Bay is in the middle there, and that's where the majority of the island's population of about 150 people live. One arm of the island runs out to the west. That's the higher part of the island, so islanders call it the upper end, and then the other arm of the island runs to the south, and we call that the lower end. Rathlin obviously is closer to the Irish mainland, but it also has that proximity to Scotland, and in many respects you can find a close link or a clear influence of Scotland on Rathlin. The Mull of Kintyre feels very close, only about 23 kilometres away, and Islay is about 30 kilometres away, and on a really clear day you can see parts of Scotland beyond as well. Now to start off, we're just going to look quickly at some of the things Rathlin is famous for.
In terms of its natural history, Rathlin is probably best known for its magnificent seabird colony, with just incredible numbers of these birds crowding the cliffs of the island during the spring and the summer. Of course, everyone's heard about the puffins, but we like to champion these other species too, particularly the common guillemots, because really it's the sensational numbers of those that make Rathlin seabird colony so spectacular. But for once, we're not going to be talking about birds today.
Rathlin is also famous for its exceptional marine biodiversity, but there are other people that could tell you about that much better than we could. We've stolen this image here from Christine Morrow's talk about the marine life of Rathlin, which I highly recommend you find on YouTube for a nice overview of the many species present and the work done by Christine, Bernard Picton and others recording the marine life and in numerous cases documenting species that were new to science. So we're highlighting this as a very significant aspect of Rathlin's biodiversity, but we're not meant to be talking to you about that right now. But while we're on the marine life, we just wanted to briefly mention the grey seals, as it is pupping season on Rathlin right now, and that is one of our highlights of the year. We've been keeping an eye on the grey seal pup numbers. The slide here says 120 pups born so far this season. Actually, that's well out of date by now. It just keeps going up and up. Last year, we managed to count 190 in total, but we've a feeling this year we might have a few more than that. And we're just going to see what happens over the next few weeks.
And another thing that we're not meant to be talking about is Rathlin's unique and world famous golden hair. And really, this is just an odd genetic mutation that's cropped up amongst the island's population of Irish hares, and that mutation persists at a low level within the population. So at any given time, there's only a tiny number of these golden individuals with the blonde fur and the blue eyes actually in existence. So you really do have to be very lucky to see one of these.
Another significant feature of Rathlin that we're not going to talk about is the high diversity of grassland fungi present on the island, which we thought we'd mention as it's now the time of year to get out and enjoy all their wonderful colours and forms. There's at least 31 species of waxcap that's been recorded on Rathlin so far, as well as a good list of all the entalomas, dermalomas, corals, clubs, earth tongues, etc. And some of these are now rare elsewhere, and as a group, they They have a particular conservation status as being indicators of high quality grassland habitats, which of course does have a close link to the flora of the island. And this is because the grasslands on Rathlin have mostly been spared the more intensive agricultural practices that have occurred elsewhere across the mainland.
What we are going to talk about is Rathlin's diverse flora, a very small sample of which is shown in this collage here. So currently about 500 species of vascular plants are known to grow in the wild on the island, and that total includes numerous species which are regionally notable and significant. And we'll talk about some of those very shortly.
But first we want to put our plant recording efforts into context a bit. So the photos here show us getting out and about all over the island. Basically, we are interested in finding, identifying and recording anything and everything. When Rick and I came to Rathlin, we were already very keen birders, and we were also regularly doing moth and butterfly recording as well. And then we set about learning more about other taxa and recording whatever we happened to find. Most of what we were finding were species that were common and widespread, but often enough we would find something that was actually quite rare or significant. Certainly it was easy to find things that had never been recorded on Rathlin before, but sometimes we would find things that had never been recorded anywhere in Northern Ireland before, and once or twice we've had firsts for the whole of Ireland. So we've been trying to share what we've learned as much as possible with islanders and anyone else who's interested in Rathlin. And we have a blog where you can find our various reports and posts about all sorts of things. And we also report many of our sightings on Twitter and put videos on YouTube. If you want to find any of that, just search for Rathlin Sticky Beak.
Our species recording on Rathlin so far is summed up in this colourful pie chart. And as you can see, between the two of us, we've now recorded about 2,170 species of things on the island. And there are some taxa, some groups of species for which we've really hardly even scratched the surface yet. There are some others where we've had a fair go. We've recorded quite a bit. Things like beetles in the mid blue on the right, and the fungi in the brown, where we have actually recorded quite a large number of species already. But no doubt there's still a lot of work to do, a lot more species to be found and identified. But for some taxa, our recording is now relatively comprehensive. Birds, for example, in the yellow, we're nearly at 200 species of bird on the island, and it's now a very rare and exciting day when we manage to add anything to that list. Moths as well in the dark blue in the top right. We've been recording them pretty intensively ever since 2017, and are getting close to 500 species of those now, although it never ceases to amaze us that we continue to add moth species on quite a regular basis. And then we've got plants in green, with the vascular plants in the darker green, now making up just about the biggest wedge of this pie, with almost exactly 500 species recorded on the island so far.
Right, let's get on with plants properly now. The picture on the left here shows our own copy of Margaret Dixon's A Flora of Rathlin Island. You can probably see there the cover's full of creases. It's been very well used. It's got loads of our own notes on the inside. Margaret sadly is no longer with us, but she was very well known on Rathlin as Flowery Margaret for all the work that she did botanising on Rathlin and making this list of species available to everyone. This version of Margaret's Flora was printed about 10 years ago, and it's been enormously useful to us as beginners, helping us learn about which species were recorded on the island. But there's now a number of recent additions and other revisions that could be incorporated into an updated flora list for Rathlin. On the right there, you can see David McNeil out in the field on Rathlin, and also with a group he brought over botanising last year. As BSBI County Recorder for Antrim, David has done loads of surveying and recording on Rathlin, and he's been very generous with his time and knowledge, encouraging us to do more of our own plant recording. The general aim has been to update the Rathlin flora list by investigating as much of the island as possible, particularly those areas with little previous coverage. Also hunting for species that were recorded in the past, but for which we have no recent records. We're also aiming to record the distribution of plant species across the island, particularly those rare or significant species. And we're always looking to find new species that haven't been recorded before, but by this stage it's now quite a challenge to find anything new plant-wise on Rathlin.
And here we have a selection of Rathlin scenes which illustrate a bit of the variety of habitats that we have on the island. Um, Various parts of Rathlin are designated as ASSIs on account of their habitats and flora. For example, the island's coastline is designated for vegetative features of its basalt cliffs, things like rosewood and juniper, and some other species that grow lower down on the shore, things like oyster plant, Scots lovage, salt marsh flat sedge. And then other parts of the island are designated for their mosaics of dry heath, fen habitat, and acid grassland. A particular characteristic of Rathlin is this purple and gold scenery that you see in the top left, and that's a particular community of dry heath, which is made up of the western gorse and the bell heather and the ling, which all flower together in the late summer to give that purple and gold colour scheme. Earlier in the summer, we have spectacular carpets of heath-spotted orchids, as shown on the left there, and also northern marsh orchids, and then various other orchid species that occur in lower abundance. A lot of the wetland and fen habitats contain a good variety of sphagnum mosses and sedges, and a lot of them also have things like marsh St. John's wort and bladderwort, black bog rush, and charophytes as well.
We'll have a quick look now at some of the iconic Rathlin species. Oyster plant is one that always gets a lot of interest because it has a mainly northern distribution and occurs at very few sites within Ireland. It's very distinctive with fleshy glaucous blue-grey leaves that spread over the ground and sprays of bell-shaped flowers that are pink at first and then they turn blue. On Rathlin, it's really only present in one part of the island, growing on stony beaches in the zone reached by the highest tides and storms of winter. There's a few large patches of it there, and we like to visit every year to monitor the extent of it.
Scots lovage is another very Scottish species. As you can see from the map there, its distribution goes pretty much all the way around the Scottish coast, and it even stops very neatly when it reaches the English border. Its range does extend just about into the very northernmost parts of Ireland, including on Rathlin, where it's found in a few isolated locations. Although it's not an easy plant to find here, most of the spots where it occurs are very hard to get to locations down at the bases of the sea cliffs.
Next, we've got roseroot. Again, this is a plant that many are interested in, and it's not uncommon on Rathlin, but it is quite difficult to see as it grows in the most awkward crevices on the cliffs, mainly along the north side of the island. To see it, you either have to do some very perilous peering over the cliff edge, or you can try and spot it from a boat, which is easiest in summer when its golden flowers are showing, which makes it stand out a bit more from its hiding places on the cliff.
Heath pearlwort is a very inconspicuous little plant, but it's not uncommon on Rathlin. It's found in various parts of the island, often right on the very cliff edges, although it's very easy to overlook. Elsewhere in Ireland, this species is really restricted to the very far west and far southwest of the country. And no doubt any keen botanists amongst you will have noticed straight away that image in the top right. The heath pearlwort is growing alongside the lovely little bit of chaffweed, which is another tiny inconspicuous plant that we enjoy finding on the island. It's one that we spent ages and ages hunting for, before eventually we were absolutely delighted to find a couple of these tiny plants growing on the edge of one of the freshwater lochs. But since then, we've obviously really got our eye in with chaffweed and have gone on to discover that it's present in lots of different parts of the island. Um, in fact, at the moment, we seem to almost trip over it every time we go out.
And next we've got thyme broom rape. I reckon you probably have to be quite a botanical nerd to get a thrill from a tiny plant like heath pearlwort or even chaffweed, no offence anyone. But thyme broom rape really has that wow factor to stop anyone in their tracks. Probably more than any other plant on Rathlin, we get people asking us about thyme broom rape and often telling stories of when they saw it once on Rathlin, which may well be because there was a period when it could be seen growing on thyme-covered walls at the roadside, and sadly it seems to have disappeared from those places. But otherwise it's not too difficult to still find around the coast of Rathlin, and indeed along the north coast of Antrim, including right beside the breakwater in Ballycastle Harbour, so you can have a look for it there while you're waiting to get the ferry to Rathlin.
And then we have possibly Rathlin's most famous plant, the pyramidal bugle. And this species is found nowhere else in Northern Ireland. And in the whole of Ireland, it's only known from a few sites in the Burren and Connemara, one or two of the Aran Islands, and perhaps one or two isolated spots in the far west of Donegal. And interestingly, it was first recorded on Rathlin in the early 70s, which does raise the question of whether it had been there all along and had somehow managed to avoid being seen by any of the previous botanical surveys on the island, or had it in fact just arrived on the island one way or another about that time. In 2022 and 2023, we undertook our own pyramidal bugle survey on Rathlin, where we visited all of the locations where this species had been found in the past, and we also searched any other areas of suitable looking habitat, which is mostly quite short grazed grassland on south or southwest facing slopes. And in both of those years, we recorded more than 700 flowering spikes of pyramidal bugle on the island. And normally, on Rathlin at least, pyramidal bugles are very squat, short little plants, which get to a height of no more than about 6 centimeters. But earlier this year, we did come across a couple of absolutely extraordinary specimens. And these were by far the biggest pyramidal bugles we'd ever seen. And for a time, we were going back to revisit these particular specimens, which we like to refer to as buglezilla, every single week, armed with a tape measure to measure just how big it had got. And at its peak, the longest spike of buglezilla reached 30.5 centimeters. So that's a foot long, or about 5 times the height of our normal pyramidal bugles. And interestingly, these particularly vigorous specimens were growing on a patch of land that had been accidentally burned the previous year. So it seems that this plant actually benefited from that burning in that it had somehow made it able to grow bigger and much more vigorously than we normally see from this species.
There's also a good variety of other notable plants occurring on Rathlin, including some that are otherwise rare in the county, so we've shown a selection of those here. Some of these are quite common on Rathlin in the right habitat, like the marsh, St John's wort, lesser water plantain, or bladderwort. They can all be found in numerous marshy spots and freshwater pools around the island, some close to walking trails, and some more off the beaten track as well. In the middle there, floating clubrush, that's very common on Rathlin, almost ubiquitous in the same sort of habitats. In the middle on the left, campaign, that's a naturalised plant that's very obvious in a couple of roadside locations. And this species was among those that were drawn by Catherine and Barbara Gage in the mid-19th century. So it may have escaped from a garden at some point, but it has perhaps been present on the island for at least 170 years. Other examples shown here occur very sparsely on Rathlin, some only known in a few locations or even just one particular place, things like the sea kale, hare's foot clover, rock samphire, and field gentian. And there are of course lots of others that we haven't pictured. Some of the sedges occurring on Rathlin are pretty special, such as the great fen sedge and salt marsh flat sedge, or small fruited yellow sedge, which is very inconspicuous and can be overlooked.
One thing that we've really enjoyed doing for the last few years is looking at historical plant records from the island and going out to see if we can find some of these species that were recorded decades, in some cases centuries ago, but hadn't been seen since. Um, and on this slide, we have a selection of species which had only previously been seen on the island a very long time ago. In fact, all of these dated back to the 19th century. The royal fern in the top left, um, that appears to only have ever been recorded on Rathlin around about the 1830s until just a couple of years ago. David McNeill, the county recorder for plants in Antrim, spotted one of these ferns hiding in the middle of a reed bed. And and then a short time later, Hazel found another one in a different location. And it does go to show that even quite a big, conspicuous plant like this can manage to stay hidden for such a long period of time without anyone noticing it, even on a relatively small island. The rest of the species on this slide date back to Samuel Stewart's botanical survey of the island in the early 1880s. And in most cases, it's hard to know whether these species have been present on Rathlin all along and have just gone unnoticed that whole time, or whether they perhaps did disappear for much of the last 100 years or so and have more recently reappeared on the island. Certainly some of them, like annual nowel and water purslane, are very small, very inconspicuous plants that could easily avoid detection for long periods of time. But those ones in particular are plants that, since we've really gone hunting for them and looking hard in suitable habitat all over the island, we have discovered that they're actually quite common and widespread on Rathlin. We've certainly found them in quite a lot of different locations now. But there are still some historical Rathlin plants that remain to be discovered, and we're going to leave these here as a challenge to any keen botanists visiting Rathlin in the coming years. Although actually, we'd probably be pretty miffed if anyone came here and found one of these species before we do.
As we've already mentioned, plants that haven't been recorded on Rathlin before are quite hard to come by, but there have been a few recent discoveries and we've shown a few examples here. The beach is always a dynamic environment, so that's been quite fruitful for new arrivals. We were excited to learn about the raised knotgrass from Keith Gilmore, and we probably walked past it ourselves a great many times without noticing it on the beach. Whirlgrass is another one that Rick found on the beach a couple of years ago. Interestingly, that looks like it's the coastal uniflora form, which doesn't seem to have many Irish records. Marram also appeared just as a single tussock, but it only lasted for about a year before it disappeared again. The island's first and only record of pyramidal orchid did an even quicker disappearing act than that. One randomly popped up next to the outdoor gym in the harbour one day, and it was so splendid we went back again the next day to admire it, but when we got there, all we found was a sad, empty, round hole in the ground where someone had dug it out and stolen it. Also, Babington's leek is a very striking one. These now appear every year in a prominent location right by the side of the road, probably escaped from a nearby garden, but they've established themselves well there, and we always enjoy seeing them as we go past.
And we're going to finish with what's possibly our rarest and most intriguing discovery on the island so far. A couple of years ago, we found in one particular pond this quite large charophytes growing in quite some abundance. And at the time, we didn't really know anything about charophytes, but with David McNeil's help, we sent off a sample of this plant to Cillian Roden, an expert in Galway. And Cillian looked at the samples and was sufficiently intrigued that the very next year he came up to Rathlin to see the site for himself and to get some more samples. And here we do have, there's a photo there by Rhonda Ridley of Cillian proudly brandishing a piece of the Rathlin charophyte, and another photo of him there snorkeling in one of the island's freshwater lochs, much to the amusement of the locals and visitors to the island on that day. And since then, Cillian has sent samples off to other experts in Britain and in Germany, and the consensus of opinion seems to be that what we have here is something called Cara affinis. And Cara affinis hasn't been recorded anywhere else in Ireland, and in Britain it's only known from the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. And previously, Cara affinis was treated as a form of the rare brackish species Cara baltica. But more recently, it now seems to be somewhat tentatively treated as a species in its own right. Anyway, since then, we've since looked in other ponds and water bodies all over the island and haven't found anything else that looks anything like this at all. So as far as we know, it really is restricted to just one particular small pond. But as another challenge that we'll leave to anyone who's keen to go charophyte hunting, keen to get their snorkel and their flippers out, there must be lots of very similar ponds and water bodies on the mainland of Ireland, potentially in the Antrim Plateau perhaps, and maybe Cara affinis remains in some of those places waiting to be discovered too.
We've now moaned a few times about it being hard to find new plants on Rathlin, but there's definitely still plenty to learn. There are parts of the island that are far less well surveyed, and there are still those historical records to try and re-find, as well as continuing to monitor the rare and significant species. If we were going to get really competitive about extending the Rathlin flora species list, there's probably scope to start looking at plants that can be separated into hundreds of microspecies like dandelions and brambles. So if anyone fancies coming over to the island to do that, you are most welcome to get stuck in. And that's the end of our talk. If you'd like to get more information about the flora and fauna of Rathlin, you can check out our blog, search for Rathlin Sticky Beak. And on there you can find links to things like our flora gallery that has photos of plant species recorded on Rathlin, nicely arranged by family. Thanks very much for listening.